right, podcast people, welcome back to Drug Dealing. This is episode 5, and we have a very special interview for you today. Kenny, who are we speaking to?
Speaking to Joe McCann, he is the CEO and co-founder of Slingshot Insights. I think the most relevant thing for people to know as we think about how to talk to doctors is how many doctors and calls has Joe done? He's spoken to, we estimate, he gets into this, he's done about 10,000 KOL calls. So I can't think of a better person to talk to on this topic. And it's a two-pronged conversation, Shivu. It's from the industry's perspective. You know, the folks that look into TPPs and try to predict how a drug might be utilized in the space long before it's approved. How do they engage with physicians better? What can they do to pull more insights out? And the one I think that's near and dear to all of us is how can a patient do the same thing for themselves? Joe is unique in that he provides both. And the reason why this topic is so important, unfortunately, healthcare is not equitable in this country. It's pretty well understood. And I initially wanted to create slides, but I thought there's actually simple analogies for this. Most people know about Cleveland Clinic, and most people also know that it's a leader in cardiology. That there suggests already there's asymmetry. One place is known to be so dominantly good. In oncology, we all know about MSKCC in New York. We also know about MD Anderson in Texas. Already you see from these things, aside from major metropolitans, that there are thought leaders in pockets of the United States that not everybody has access to. So the topic of healthcare inequity is very well understood. There are detailed slides, CDC has them, for things like hypertension and heart attacks, where there are higher rates, cancer, dementia, things like that as well. And so we wanted to bring Joe in and a little bit about his background and talk about KOL calls, how to interface with doctors, get better care for yourself. If you're a professional in the space, how can you work with a KOL's bias? And so CEO and co-founder of Slingshot Insights, he started that company 11 years ago, and he mentions it started with just him and another co-founder. They're now up to over 25 people, I believe. Prior to starting Slingshot Insights, Joe was an analyst at CR Intrinsic, which was a division of SAC Capital for many years, where he specialized in healthcare, specifically pharmaceuticals. So throughout the span of his life, he's been involved in this type of space. How do I get insights from leaders?
Awesome. You know, we should just preface, none of this is medical advice. This is strictly for podcast entertainment purposes and educational purposes only. So we do touch on a lot of subjects about, you know, how to talk to your doctor and aspects of medical care. This is not medical advice whatsoever. You should always, you know, make those decisions in consultation with a healthcare practitioner. But hopefully after this conversation, you feel more empowered to do that sort of thing. And so with that, let's get to our conversation with Joe.
All right, Joe, thank you for joining the Drug Dealing Podcast. It's a real treat to have you here today. I was thinking back to how long I've known you. I think we're not quite at a decade, but I think we're getting there, which is kind of hard to believe because it feels like we were working together just recently. So I'm sure you know, today's topic is about how to talk to doctors. And the approach that we were taking was essentially two-pronged. One from industry, you know, pharmaceuticals, drug developers, strategics, maybe even investors, how they look into developing medicines and being a part of that, but also from the patient side. And both of them, I think, are so important. And they're quite technical and difficult, but they're also, I feel, not as well discussed. And there's so much value that can be extracted from both sides. And when I was thinking and talking to Shivu about who are some of the people that would know the best of this space, Joe, I don't know anyone better than you. And so that's why I wanted to just get your insights. And I think the impact that you can have on the industry and on individuals and patients, which we can all relate to, could be profound. So that's just setting up the topic for today. And maybe if we could start with a little bit about your background, how you fell into this, and a little bit about what excites you about the space.
Yeah, Kenny, great to be on the podcast, and haven't done a podcast in many years, so it's good to be back and doing some media. Can't believe it's been 10 years since we met. It does feel like yesterday. I think it was originally just coming into our site as an interested investor, and then that grew into more corporate relationships, and now podcasts, and who knows what'll come next. So yeah, appreciate you having me on. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting time for the space of expert calls, whether it's physicians or industry experts or people in automotive and things like that. There's a lot of different things going on that we can get into during the conversation, but it's just a space that's remained really valuable to people who are trying to understand things quickly And that can be whether it's an investor trying to understand, is what management telling me cool and great and going to be used by a lot of people? Or is it just a guy trying to keep his job? Or is it, somebody in my family or having with myself that has something new in medicine that they have to deal with? And is this a way to maybe get your head around an area that you haven't ever been exposed to in the past? So there's a lot of value in being able to get somebody highly, highly skilled that's maybe spent a lifetime on a very particular topic, 100% of their attention for 30, 45 minutes. So happy to kind of start with the beginning of what an expert call is and what the industry is, or tell you a little bit about my background. But I think, it's a really interesting space and definitely a unique time for everyone that's in the
Yeah,
industry.
I'm aligned with you on that. Let's start with your background. I think it'd be helpful for people to know a little bit because I got the one question, man, I have to ask you is whenever you're ready, how many calls have you done in your life? I have a number in my head and I think it's substantial, but I'm curious about that one too.
Oh God, I probably should
Unders
track.
on this number. There's all the sports books are
Is that flashing on the
keen to
screen where I
know.
can't see? Anybody in the comments can go. We can start over under 10,000 and a half. I honestly don't
That's
know. I mean,
crazy.
when I was on the buy side, I was probably doing, we talk about my career, but I was probably doing between 1 and 2,000 calls a year, maybe 800 to 1,500 calls a year. And then I've been doing this company for 11 years now. Fortunately, I don't lead as many calls as I used to. We've grown to a point where we have a lot of other people doing that now, but I do train all the people who lead it. And I don't know. I haven't counted. I've tried to figure it out just for curiosity, but I'd say it's probably over 10,000 at this point. Over
That's
five for
amazing.
sure. Yeah. To give you some of my background, I mean, I really don't have a medical background. It kind of shows, I think, to some degree, well, I don't know how good I am at leading these calls, but it shows to some degree how powerful they are to be able to get up to speed to something quickly. At undergrad, I had an entrepreneurship and finance background with a history minor. So didn't really have much biotech, healthcare exposure. I don't think I had a chemistry or science class since high school. So, coming into the world of finance was really finance based. I joined the healthcare group at Deutsche Bank in the investment banking team. And the reason I chose that wasn't so much healthcare. It was that was one of the few groups at Deutsche Bank that did every type of product. They were involved in equities, follow-ons, M&A, debt. And as an entrepreneur, I kind of wanted to have exposure to all different types of finance. So it wasn't even really a healthcare passion out of the gate. The tech team was out of San Francisco. I didn't want to move to San Francisco. Really, I came into it at 22 looking at how do I get the broadest experience of the investment banking culture for the 2 or 3 years I was going to be there. I ended up loving the industry and finding it extremely interesting. There's just so much going on the innovation side, so many different companies being formed, so many different complex topics coming together, whether it's litigation and patent law, which actually really has more impact, I would say, that in healthcare than it does in tech companies. I mean, yeah, there's some patents around tech, but really the small molecules, the device method of use patents really apply probably nowhere more than the healthcare industry. So love that aspect of it. Love learning the science aspect of it, and ended up getting fortunate enough to get a job on the buy side at a hedge fund. Back then it was called SAC. It's now called Point 72. I actually worked at a division called CR Intrinsic, and I was just kind of one of the many brand umbrellas they had there at the time. I think it's now all Point 72, but they had 3 or 4 different banners, but we all shared the same, coffee pot and office in Connecticut and New York. So it wasn't really much of a distinction, but ended up working on a 2-person team there for about 4 years. We ran anywhere from, well, I don't know if I should disclose the amount, but a global portfolio that originally focused on specialty pharma companies back when that was a vibrant industry, line extension, formulations, better dosing, better drug delivery products, and all that type of stuff. Eventually, that industry really consolidated, and we moved into everything in healthcare. Medical devices, biotech, managed care was the era of like Obamacare coming out and that whole litigation or legislation, ultimately it's no litigation. And how do you think about managed care organizations in a expansion or privatization, or what was it going to be? So we did a lot of that. Throughout every step of that journey, I would say expert calls were essential to understanding what was going on, or what is this industry, this disease, this topic that I've never experienced before. And we can talk about my method of how to get up to speed quickly, but I found it to be really an invaluable resource to know what you're talking about or cut down the learning curve, and became, foundational to everything I do. And my investing career. And then when I left the firm, we can talk about any of these in more detail. When I left the firm, I realized I didn't have access to that resource anymore, that expert calls were really only available to the largest institutions, the biggest, either consulting companies, corporates, or investors, hedge funds, and that nobody out there who wasn't at one of those institutions had any access to it. So we launched Slingshot Insights with the idea of bringing that level expert, that level of insight and timeliness to anyone. So we launched with a platform where anybody in the world can come on, submit a topic, can contribute a question to a topic that's already out there, can raise their hand and say, I want to lead the call, and suggest it and say, I hope somebody else wants to lead the call. Record that conversation, transcribe that conversation, make it available on the web so that anybody can come in if they missed it, access it, and take something that used to be a very inefficient industry, I would say, and a lot of aspects of it still are, but take a very inefficient industry and say, instead of doing 50 calls with the same guy over and over and everybody doesn't share any notes, let's create a single transcript, make it available, reduce 50 calls down to one. If somebody has a follow-up question or another question or wants to do a private call off of that, fine, but you're not starting at zero. So that's really been the journey that we've been on for 11 years now. And my experience, going all the way back to 2008, I started doing these calls. So when I say 10,000, it ends up not being that many, maybe year to year, because I've been doing it for far longer than I wish.
And I'm curious, Joe. So, when you started, who were some of the people that were interested, and has that customer base evolved over time?
So it's always been a challenge for us, I think, to communicate the value of these to people who don't have exposure to them. It's funny, the first time that I learned what an expert network was, I had no idea. I was interviewing for the hedge fund job and had worked on this model. It was a diligence project on the drug retigabine, which was a epilepsy drug from Vertex, actually, not Vertex, Valiant back in the day. And it was right around the time that Valiant got new ownership. Mike Pearson came in, and it was this disparate, branded generic global company. And I built this whole model. And then I had this opinion on the epilepsy drug and that the company should sell it and get rid of it. And my guy I was interviewing with was, well, why would you say that? Like, what doctor should you talk to? What's your diligence on retigabine? I said, well, I don't know. How would I do that? And he said, oh, you don't know what expert calls are. We would do a dozen calls with all the leading epilepsy people to look at all the data from retigabine. So he sent me home to make a list of questions, but it was really one of these moments where I had no idea, even though I had been at an investment bank at that point for 2 years, had done 8 or 9 real deals and just had no insight into that existing. So it's always been our mission and kind of a battle for us to explain to people how powerful those calls are, why they're worth a little bit of money. But it is really one of those things that it's the first thing that comes up if you're a professional. Who did you talk to? Did you talk to the guy at Johns Hopkins? Did you talk to the guy who developed the drug? And so I don't think that's changed. I do think that there's becoming, over time, a broader understanding of how valuable these things are and how people who use them can get a lot of quick value. But it really has remained an institutional product that we're trying to get into the hands of more people.
Various, facets of institution industry. Do you find that some are asking more pointed or detailed questions versus some are almost high level? You know what I mean? Like there's some calls, Joe, we've all read the transcripts or heard that's like you could have just read a JAMA publication and covered all that. Like there's no need for that. It's almost like a summary versus let's actually talk about like the endpoint, how it was powered, did they hit it? And is that enough given the safety profile, those types of things? Have you found like differences across the industry as to how deep people get into that?
I think that's probably the biggest gap. And people are always asking us, how do you differentiate your network versus others and all these types of things. And leading calls in an effective way that go beyond the surface level is probably the biggest differentiator on these things. Obviously who the expert is good as well, but everybody who has the same conversation with the same expert is getting to the same level of detail. Corollary, I would say, when training people on doing expert calls and thinking about it as a graduate level class. So I don't know, I never got a master's, but even in the 400 level classes in college, you have maybe a large lecture. And then on Friday morning or something, you have a breakout with a TA and you talk for 2 or 3 hours about the material. You go into that meeting on Friday morning, not to learn what the material said. You go in to discuss it and you read all the stuff beforehand. When you get into that conversation, you're challenging, well, what I learned in my other class relates to it this way. And my perception of what this passage meant felt like this to me. And so you're getting into a dialogue around what was in the materials, not reviewing them. And I think a big difference between a well-led expert call and a surface level one is you're kind of doing the pre-reading before you get into the meeting and pulling from your curriculum all semester or your career around that mechanism or the history of that drug in other places or that disease or points of care challenges and how that might relate. And so really pushing the expert to go beyond it and not regurgitate what was in the press release or in the JAMA article or whatever, but thinking about it like I'm in a high level discussion class and we're going to really challenge each other and figure out what's good. I think that makes a world of difference. Because the experts really, they're not there to educate you. I mean, yes, some of them are passionate about it, but they're there to answer your questions. Fine. They don't know the level of sophistication they're dealing with on the phone either. So if you're asking basic questions, they're happy to rip through it with you, and 30 minutes goes by and they get their payment. So it's really up to the call leader to think about these things. We can go into more best
I guess
practices, but that's a big
in
one.
your career, as you were leading so many of these calls, I mean, take us back to, or, maybe transport yourself back to the first call that you ever did and where you are now. Like what did you know after doing like 1,000 calls that you wish you knew in your first call that gave you that deeper engagement, and made you feel like you got a lot more out of those conversations with physicians?
Yeah, it's funny. I think, part of it's confidence and, some of it's a little bit personality driven, I think, in terms of like, are you the person who's willing to admit they don't know something, or even if you do kind of know it, get the expert to say it. So it's a lot of humility, I would say, because being the questioner isn't a contest of showing what you know. And a lot of people, particularly in finance, want to look like or come across as the smartest person in the room or on the team. And if you're sharing the call with other people, then even more ego comes into it. So a lot of it is about understanding that the role of the questionnaire is to get either confirmation or the expert's opinion, not your own. And so I think that that's something that, I don't know how many calls it takes, but that's something that you need to have as a disposition. And I think in the beginning, you're kind of nervous that you're going to be known as a neophyte or somebody who doesn't know anything. I'll give you an anecdote about one of my early calls and laughing about that. But yeah, it's really about not pretending or feeling like you have to belong. Like you're paying for this person's time. You want their opinion. If you don't know something, that's fine. That's why you're on the phone. And I think that's a huge difference. And then the second one is just being a really active listener. Like don't go through your questions. Don't go through your discussion guide. Listen to what the person's saying, connect it back. I'm always telling people, like, challenge any incongruities, right? What you really want is coherency across the expert's views, because a lot of times if they're not challenged, they'll tell you something that in one hand sounded good and then 5 minutes later sounds good, but they don't work together. And so you really need to be an active listener, not going off your, okay, so then how would you prescribe it? Okay. How do you feel about that? Okay. Like if you're going through the discussion guide, you're not, well, wait a second. You said that, the amount of time that patients in the doctor's office is a big problem, but then this is adding 10 minutes. How's that going to work? Like that type of stuff and really being active is going to make a huge difference. And I do think by like the 1,000th call, you get a really good sense of when these guys aren't engaged, when they're kind of giving you their script, when the things that are coming up aren't really making sense. And those really make for valuable nuggets in the call.
Joe, do you ever take this approach with your KOL? So I want to just highlight. So KOL is a key opinion leader. This is typically a very highly, in our industry at least, a highly respected physician, maybe a researcher or expert with deep experience and potentially even influence in a particular field. Do you ever sometimes just go through their publications to get a flavor for how they view the space and their drugs? Because I find that to be really helpful. And if the call by chance is challenging their historic treatment paradigm, I might expect a little more resistance. It's almost like I build in my mind a qualitative profile for what I might expect on some of the topics. Is that an approach that you find is helpful?
I think it can be, especially if you're it depends on the type of expert you're speaking to. And if you're talking to a KOL or somebody who's in the industry, then you can definitely be aware of their biases. So example might be, I'm talking about a competitor or a drug that's in phase 3, but this person is the lead investigator on a competitor's phase 2. And so, they have a lot of incentives, whether it's conscious or not, to be advocating for that program that they're more involved with, even if they're not giving you confidential information or any of those things, obviously. But they're just, well, this drug has this problem and that problem. And so you're going to have biases there. So I think it's definitely very important to be aware of maybe even unknown biases in the expert's profile, which can be done by that, can be done by looking at clinical trials, by good screening questions before you get into the call. Doesn't mean you don't want to speak to them, right? Because you want to hear the advocate of each side. Doing multiple calls when you really care about something is extremely important. No one has the magic, view. There is no omnipotent person usually in any industry who just, if I say it's that way, it's that way. So yeah, it really becomes essential to balance people. And we can go into how to do a good series of calls. But yeah, I do think that that's a really important thing to do. Sometimes even asking other experts, well, I talked to this doctor, and he had this view, and they'll say, wow, of course, John's been working with so-and-so forever on that. And you're like, oh, I didn't know. Yeah, he worked in so-and-so's lab back in 90. Because some of these industries, especially when you get into, let's say, an orphan disease or a very niche mechanism, are very small, right? These guys all know each other. They share compounds in their labs. They have seen each other speak. They're kind of rivals on on paper publishing circuits and things. So yeah, there can be a lot of benefits to understanding what else they're working on, as well as kind of mentioning things across experts and hearing what they think of each other.
So part of that was almost like a hat tip to how I envision someone with your expertise might prepare for some of these things. Anything we've grazed some of the topics already. Anything else that you would recommend for folks like as they try to prepare for these types of calls they should consider, or things that you found are time savers and very effective?
I mean, it depends on what kind of resources the person has access to. So if you have access to sell side notes, that can be a great spot to get a sense of what other investors or people are thinking. If you have access to paywalled articles and journalists. There's some great work that's done out of Stat News, let's say, or Endpoints, or even Substacks and things like that now. So kind of getting a sense of both what other investors or other people interested in that industry are thinking is a really good way to create insightful questions to the person. And then also just kind of, you don't need to necessarily read every word of every journal publication on the molecule or something like that, but understanding, how's the company positioning it? What's in the press releases? What are in the tables when you look at actual peer-reviewed literature? And having a good handle on those things is really helpful. But, to me, it's always a balancing act. Is particularly from an investor perspective. Look, what are people not understanding about the story? What are people overestimating about the story? Does this person go along with it, and how much credibility is there to, I don't know, say, like, not a conspiracy theory, but that like nugget of doubt that you're seeing, like, well, I don't think this nanoparticle thing matters, or I don't think daily dosing or weekly dosing versus daily dosing is better, or whatever, right? And seeing what the pushback is from the skeptics, and then bringing that to the experts. It's kind of like why I never understand companies that don't speak to short sellers or something, right? Because you want to hear what they're saying. You want to make sure your messaging
Absolutely.
gets in front of it, and you have to persuade them at some point, or not. So I think really going into the people who don't agree with you, understanding that, and then bringing it to the conversation is a really powerful way to get confidence, because maybe they persuade you. I mean, that's the biggest thing about all this, right? You're doing these calls to be persuaded one way or another, and you're not here spending this money to be convinced that you are already right.
Goes into, even before you're prepping for a particular call with the KOL or other type of physician, how do you ensure you're sourcing the right person to speak with? I think Kenny and I have done some of these calls like throughout, our career, and or had, consultants that we worked with do some of these things, and you sometimes read some of these transcripts and you can easily tell that like this person that was selected to be someone who's giving insights is not even like the right person to be speaking with, or they're just, way out of their depth on something, and maybe they're just not the right fit. So how do you that filter of like, how do you bring in the right people who without having spoken to them before, know that they're the right person to shed light on these important questions that you have? What does that process look like?
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to kind of two things. One is, what are you really trying to get a perspective on? There's a fascination in the industry, I think, of talking to key opinion leaders, but a lot of the time that's not where care gets dispensed, and that's not how medicine is delivered to patients across the country, right? So sometimes you don't necessarily want the guy who spent his whole career on it. I think those are very useful when you're understanding if a drug's going to work, what expectations are for a trial to be sufficient. As you get further along the story, and if we talk about patient journeys as well down the road, and thinking about talking to doctors, sometimes you want to talk to a person who doesn't know everything, who doesn't or hasn't already read the publication, or doesn't spend all of his time on this, because as an investor, you have to see if that message is going to get through to them, and if what the company and the key opinion leaders are saying is resonating. So I think that what you're trying to get out of a conversation is extremely important when picking the expert. And that's a framework that people need to think about. In terms of trying to get the best expert, let's say, on a topic who really does know those things, I think it's a combination of 2 or 3 lenses that you want to be looking at. I think the first lens that you want to be looking at is just their stature in the space. Are they publishing? Are they at a good teaching hospital? Are they at an academic institution that's really well respected? Do they have a history of working with drug development or clinical development or medical device development in their career so that they understand things like powering of trials and endpoint selection and patient inclusion and all those types of things that, an average community doctor may never have to think about in his career after med school. You might take one class and then be really worried about, well, how do I make sure the MRI is read right? Or how do I convince my patient to take the medicine every day, right? You have a very different set. I think that's one thing. And then I think the other thing is screening questions that you get to share with a company like mine. Anybody who's going out and reaching out to an expert network is allowed to put their own screening questions in. And so I think there's a lot of things you can put in, but it could be familiarity with drugs in the space, number of patients, have you prescribed this thing before? And so really trying to make sure that there's a familiarity with it. On surveys, sometimes we'll see, we have even some people who are tricky and will put in fake drugs on the screening questions. On a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you know this drug and it's fake? Oh, everybody who says over a 4 is out because it doesn't exist and they're just like lying to us, right? So there's all these little things that you can do. For our network, one of the things that we do for every expert is we give them an internal score that no one sees on a scale of 1 to 4. And, what kind of quality are they? It's not always as obvious as you think. Sometimes the excellent people are diamonds in the rough and not who you'd know, but building out a network and working with a professional company like ourselves or even our competitors should be able to give you some insight into, hey, this guy's great on this topic, or you want to talk to him, or she's really knows how to articulate the viewpoints and is very clear in her answers. So I think it's a little bit of working with your network, a little bit of screening, and then just a little bit of the bio in that abstract sense of like why is this person good to tie?
There's a lot of wisdom in what you're saying, Joe, and even the way you maybe even bifurcate physicians. I heard you use the phrase community academic. So Shivu and I were talking about this. How do we think about, from the industry perspective? You may not think about this as a patient as much. Kind of think about them in two camps. You have the academic and community PIs. And so I just want to ask, like, in your work, is that how you see that's a great way to split it? Is that optimal? How do you try to identify, let's say I'm going to get 10 calls on this topic. Let's do half and half. Or maybe I don't need as many community. I need more academic because their phenotypes are somewhat different, like you alluded to. And then do you engage with them differently? I'm just trying to understand like how you navigate the differences between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have different questions for different types of people. I think there's certain, like I said, if you're really trying to get into more clinical trial design, point design, nuances of what may or may not happen in a trial, it could be hard to do. To have that dialogue with a physician who spends most of his or her time dealing with patients, just because that's not the framework that they're looking at. If you're trying to then look at, let's say, data or new results or even expectations for a trial, speaking to a community physician might be equally, if not more important, because they have their standard of care and they have their own inertia, I would say, of how they do things. So talking to them about what the bar is for them to change practice behavior might be different than an academic, because an academic might be very excited about a 5% improvement in progression-free survival, or 80 versus 75% on a skin clearance score, and PASI 90 needs to be 88. Well, that's better than 90 or than 84, so I'm going to use it. Community doctor might say, well, yeah, come on, 88, 84, what's the difference? You definitely, I think it's very helpful to kind of have that researcher academic mindset and understand what those people are thinking and how they're evaluating things. And then that, frontline high volume, I see 50 patients or I see a large number of patients in this indication, and what's going to get me to install maybe, the ability to do IV in my practice where I don't, or maybe I have to create a waiting room for anaphylaxis. Like, I'm going to try not to do that if I can. Okay, well, that's a concern if I expect this to roll out, and there's probably, we can all think of examples in the space over the years where those types of things have derailed drug adoptions and things like that. So yeah, I do think there's a clear difference in the two, and I do think that they both have really useful roles in understanding things.
Do you notice any general patterns of thinking or habits of thinking between the two archetypes of doctors? I mean, obviously it's kind of hard to generalize across so many diseases and so many different foci of investigation. Just generally, like, are there patterns that you can comment on about community docs tend to X, KOLs tend to Y?
Yeah, I think, attention bandwidth, not necessarily that the people don't pay attention, but the attention bandwidth and the ability to be looking at the next new drug that came out or following clinical trial developments and all that type of stuff is very hard for a person who's seeing a lot of patients every day and really on the front line of point of care. And so in the academic space, you see people that are really following the news of drug development, of the FDA, and they're really kind of plugged into that world for their little fiefdom or kingdom of focus, right? The community doctors, like a drug might get approved, like, oh yeah, I haven't heard that. Like the drug reps will come by in 6 months and I'll see. A lot of them might want to wait a year before they even start to use it to see what their peers are learning. And they just say like, wow, I just don't use anything for the first year. Oh, why is that? Well, like the drug development trials are one thing, but in the real world, how they're going to perform. I want to hear what my peers say. I'll go to the next conference next year and see what the word on the street is. And so I think there's just a very different approach to innovation in the community space. And there's very good reasons for it. It's not like they're being negligent. I think part of it's time in the day. Part of it is an understanding that clinical trials are different than their patients, right? You're excluding a lot of types of patients a lot of the time that maybe are representative of a practice, which could be, other drugs they're on. It could be comorbidities. It could be age. It could be any number of things that are not happening in the development cycle. So it's not like this is a bad thing necessarily that a community doctor is waiting, but there's just definitely a different urgency around it, a different closeness to it than the academic doctors who are trying to figure out where their paper fits or what the next clinical trial to get their patients in, because that's what they have set up, a clinical trial enrollment practice. Like they're just thinking about things a little differently. And again, I don't know if we get into that at the end of this call, but as a patient, you can also use that to your benefit and potentially thinking and how you get treated if something comes up.
Do you think their risk profile is different? We do use that four-letter word risk, but sometimes when I hear you explaining the different phenotypes, I wonder, is that a way to think about it? That maybe the communities, physicians, or risk tolerance for new drugs. I want to wait a year. I want real world data. I want to see how it applies to this patient population versus academic might be more inclined to try something, even if they weren't involved with that development.
Yeah, I don't know if it's risk profile. I think it's I mean, I guess that is a lens that could be looked through. I think risk, I think, implies maybe more risk to the patient or something like that, or the decision to try it. But there's other things I think that make it challenging, right? If it's a new drug and you don't have a lot of familiarity with it, you're probably going to be maybe getting a lot of calls. You're not going to have the answers to them. You're not going to be able to tell your patient like how it works. So a lot of doctors might only try in one or two of the perfect patients and see how it goes for 6 months. So it's not necessarily risk. It's a learning curve, I think, for them a little bit. I think it's the acknowledgement that trials aren't the real world. And so you want to let the real world kind of work through it for a little while and then see what it is. So I don't want to give the impression that it's just a risk appetite thing. I do think that there's a little bit of appreciation just for the complexities of anything new, and that the whole community is going to learn more about it with more time and more people and patient live years and all that type of stuff, right? Things come up that you don't know in clinical trials, whether that's tail risk things or different patient populations being treated in the real world than the clinical trial, which is just normal.
Makes sense.
A lot of
Okay.
doctors have, I think a lot of doctors have an informal network as well, where they just kind of talk to each other, the people they know from med school, the people they meet at conferences and get along and things like that. And so they kind of let the information come through that sometimes as well.
I think
And there's
too,
also
when
the caveat I would say is it also kind of depends just on how well patients are managed on whatever the new thing is, right? Like
It's true.
if all my patients are dying, well, fine, I'll get you on, the HCV med or the HIV med. But if it's a skin rash and most stuff works fine and, this new immunosuppressant comes out, do we need to rush into this? Like, I do think that there's an urgency component that colors all this conversation that should be acknowledged.
I mean, have you in the effort to kind of think of patterns here? I mean, do you notice that with the more of the KOL archetype, the types of patients that they see are different? Like they tend to be more complicated cases, more severe cases that would require sort of like someone getting referred out to one of these larger academic centers where there's more therapeutic options, both approved and in trials.
Yeah, I mean, I think again that comes down a lot to the disease, right? If you're even a community doctor in a particularly aggressive, poorly treated disease, you're gonna want to be referring those patients into trials, and you're praying that trials exist, right? Because you don't have anything that you're happy with. So, if you have aggressive oncology patients or other things that aren't well managed with current medications, you're going to be referring in, and good physicians should be tied into a network, even if they're not actually enrolling at their own community setting. They should be driving patients to these trials because there's nothing else. And I know a lot of the times when you talk to academics, they're just excited that there's at least a trial now for these patients who previously hadn't had anything. Particularly when I first started doing orphan drugs kind of have been around for a while now, but in 2008 and 2006, I think it was kind of a new thing that some of those drugs were getting to the stage of phase 3, getting to the stage of approved. And so you just had these waves of communities of patients and physicians that were ecstatic to be able to enroll somebody or to get somebody to move along, into better treatment options.
Joe, you talked about how your experience with calls evolved over time. And I'm curious, like in live, general topic of live call tactics. Like, say, for example, you get an unexpected response relative to not only perhaps the topic, but also that KOL's history. So I'm just curious, like, or do you have any examples of maybe curveballs or how you handle them or general go-to tactics for those scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have any great tricks. I think it's never bad to kind of take a step back and repeat what you think you understood to a doctor or an expert of anything and let them critique what you're hearing, because sometimes it's your listening and sometimes it's their explanation. And you can get a sense of this. Like some doctors do a lot. I use doctors, but it really could be any expert. Some experts do a lot of these calls and really have their thoughts clarified. And it's almost a script they're running through. And if you have a new question, they're almost taken aback. Like, whoa, oh, I hadn't thought of that. Like, can't believe it. Just don't do it that much. And so you have to understand that the person you're speaking to maybe is not as didactic or as articulate or as concise as you'd like them to be. And so it's not bad to just pull out if you don't. I mean, it's your time, right? You're paying for the time. And it goes back to the humility I was talking about. So if you feel confused or you think something's conflicted or you just don't understand a word, like, I'm sorry, what is an SRE? Oh, I've never heard that. Oh, sorry, that's an acronym. And they explain it to you. So, you could be doing some Googling on the side or putting things into ChatGPT to get clarity, but there's no harm in just pulling out. I think that's like the big lesson that I would say is flexible and usable, right? Is just keeping that awareness that you're the one in control. If you don't get it, make them repeat it. If you don't get it, it doesn't mean you're stupid or that you didn't do enough prep, and don't feel like you have pressure on you in the conversation. And I think that that's sort of really the best trick, right? Because if it gets confusing or it doesn't line up, then you just don't feel like you need to pretend. And again, back to how it evolved, you just get more and more comfortable with that type of thing. And sometimes you get into conversations where you're like, wow, I don't even know what study he's talking about. I think we're off topic. And that's something that can even be handled after the call where you follow up, you look and, take down what the topic is. Oh, she's talking about some paper. I thought that was a different indication. I thought it was non-small cell lung cancer, not small cell lung cancer. And, go back and regroup after the call. And then you can go back to the expert and say, what were you talking about here? Like and a network like ours would be a middleman on that, but you could send questions and say, hey, can we get clarity on this? I didn't understand this part of the conversation. So again, it's always just realizing that it's not a single moment in time, that there's no script or pressure that you need to go through, and really just make sure that you guys are both on the same page.
And then how do we've talked about the different phenotypes and, some of them have a lot of history in maybe a specific topic and some don't. What I think is sometimes easy to gloss over is that doctors are still humans and they have certain things that they're comfortable with and certain things that are not. And so when you're trying to extract a true insight that could help whatever purpose you may have in the call, how do you handle bias?
Bias can be hard to understand because a lot of times the people don't have their own really understanding of the biases. Multiple calls can be really helpful. I think bounce those things off each other. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the ways you could do it is asking the same question from different perspectives and slightly different angles, and see if they are coherent. Again, it's really just prodding and kind of poking around. Like, well, wait, like if you don't like this type of thing, or you do like that, and this is where more reps comes in handy as well, right? If something doesn't line up with what most physicians have told you, let's say on a type of drug delivery or a pace of dosing required, right? And this doctor's really out of line on that. Like that's a place to dig in and say, well, wait, like what is going on here? Do you have a bias around something? And a lot of times that people have reasons for the bias. And so that could be something that could be useful to you when you're evaluating things. Like, is this a widespread bias? Okay, here's a great example. There was a drug for Dupuytren contracture, which is I forget the name of the drug, but it was basically a collagenate dissolving agent. So Dupuytren's is like bent finger, and you have like a cord in your finger. And the typical treatment was hand surgeons would do surgery, and it could be called trigger finger or something like that. And there's a drug that came out maybe 15, 16, 17 years ago now. I think Pfizer ended up buying it, but it would dissolve it. And so you talk to all these hand surgeons, you go to the hand surgeon conference, and they would be presenting this data to a bunch of surgeons, and all the surgeons were saying, like, why I would never use this. But why wouldn't you use this? It's just 3 injections and then a week finger opens. If you look at the picture of the surgery, this guy's hands won't cut up. This looks awful. Nah, yeah, I don't trust that stuff. You could like hit a tendon, you could rupture a knuckle. Okay, well, there's no issues with that in any of the trial. Well, that's a trial. They're all very careful. I wouldn't use it. Yeah. Well, what are you really talking to? You're talking to a person whose whole career is surgically fixing this problem, and they don't want a pharmaceutical intervention. But then you start to prod around it. Well, okay, well, how much do you make on a surgery? How much time does that take? What does this look like? Well, what if you did this? If you could do buy and build and it's 6% of the cost, okay, well, what about that? Then you can get a sense like over time, is it going to be at least economically better for the physician? Is it going to be better outcomes for the patient? Is there another class of providers of care that could do this that aren't surgeons that will then start taking the surgeon's business away and force them to learn the new method? Or maybe the surgeon right, and this drug company is trying to come up with a solution for a problem that's better solved by surgery. So yeah, that's a bias that you can identify. That's pretty obvious because you're trying to disrupt the practice in a way that might not be comfortable to the physician. Pulling on that thread and understanding the economics, the pride, the buy and build costs, the time to the practice, like all these things are how you get a model of whether this is going to be a standard of care changing option or just a drug that doesn't have a home.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great example. It just, the thing resonating or kind of vibrating in my brain is, if you understand somebody's incentives, you have a lot more clear line of sight into their potential biases.
Exactly. And again, it takes multiple perspectives and just pushing on little things that don't make sense. Like an example there would be the reason they give you isn't in the data. So why are you giving that reason? Well, okay, well, but it's like a very low percent. Well, even one is too many. Okay, well, that's okay. Well, now we're getting somewhere. Maybe that's real, maybe that's not. But yeah, really looking for things and making sure that, because usually biases get expressed in views that are not backed up by fact, right? And that's kind of what makes them a bias versus you know, an observation.
Mhm.
And so the better handle you have on the facts and the better you can like square them with what the person's saying, the more you can unravel, if it's a bias, a lie, a blind spot, or a valid point.
I was trying to think, Joe, of all the calls that you've done in your career. I'm sure you've had some maybe that I don't know what's the right phrase to describe it, but perhaps something that comes along the lines of like a red flag where you say, well, that's so there's the stuff where you have compliance rules. I know your company's really strict on those things and people follow it no matter what. That's obviously an easy one, right? If a KOL says something that's not public yet from a trial, that's clearly a red flag. But are there other things that maybe you've come across in your career that were surprising to you, or that you'd put in that category, and maybe you couldn't publish for some reason?
So I want to be clear, we have had, fortunately, no issues with material non-public information or confidential information being shared on the platform over 11 years. I think that's a testament to the compliance procedures we put in before we even launched, which we don't need to get into on this call, but important to make clear we haven't had any issues. For our platform, we have the ability of anybody to raise a flag and say, hey, something on this seemed wrong, and explain what that was. That would alert all the people that were on the call or had accessed the project, whether they had dialed in or not. Just, hey, somebody thought something bad happened on this call. Internally, we have a process to look at, well, what was that concern? Like I said, fortunately, we've never had an issue, but it could be something along the lines of material, not public information, like this clinical trial doesn't work, or this is this, or the company told me they're discontinuing the drug, but told me not to tell anybody. Like, there's all sorts of things that could be inappropriate to share. So, we do a lot to protect that, but haven't had any issues. But it's a human event, right? We do 5,000, I don't know how many we do now, like between 4 and 5,000 calls a year now. And that's a lot of human interaction. So sometimes people are sleepy on a call. Sometimes the guy seems like he was drunk from the night before, or his Ambien didn't wear off, right? So sometimes the guy, we've had people try and do the calls in convertibles driving down the highway. Like, what is going on? So there are a lot of human elements to all this stuff. And, it's just part of the business. But again, like, just hang up and either call them back or never work with them again and go and move on. None of this stuff is life and death, fortunately. Though it can
I
feel
was
that way
thinking
when
of
you
the
have
very
300 people on the line and you're like, why is the tech not working? Or why isn't this guy picking up? My God, which has happened to us, but fortunately not often.
I've been on so many KOL calls, Joe, where they're clearly using the time to organize their office. How many times do you hear papers shuffle in the background? And it's so and they stop when you ask a pointed question, and then it resumes as soon as it's like some cursory topic. It's quite frustrating sometimes.
We had one that would always be eating her lunch and should be eating an apple or something. And we're like, and we stopped working with this person over the years because like multiple clients emailing us. Is she eating an apple right now? It's a whole call, 20 minutes. What is she doing? You're making $500. Eat your apple later. So yeah, it is a human business for sure. Luckily low stakes, but human business nonetheless.
Yeah. I was also thinking, Joe, in your work, you've got a pretty interesting set of client types. And so, do you find that, investors will ask certain types of questions? Obviously, it's easy to think about maybe catalysts and feasibility of the drug if and when it ever does launch. And then if you contrast that with industry, where Shivu and I spent so many years working in things like TPP, target product profile testing and feasibility, 20% deltas on whatever metric that you think is important, whether it's safety, efficacy, or some melange of either. Do you find that there's thematic where if like, oh, okay, I have this investor series I'm going to be doing, I would assume it's these types of questions, or if industries ask me, it could be these types?
Yeah, there's definitely very well, I think to some degree it's always kind of trying to get to the same understanding, but there are definitely different styles of different types of customers. Pharmaceutical companies, I think, ask different questions than investors do. We do have a lot of, we have certain customers that are MDs themselves, researchers themselves. We have customers that like to talk to people they know from med school that were their professors back in the day. So there are definitely certain people that are extremely in the weeds on mechanisms and science and basic science, and then other people who just want to know what the bar is for the phase 3 trial. So I think it's not so much what's a different style questions for the same goal, but I think that different customers are at different points in the product life cycle. So some are wanting to get into the preclinical stuff, and is the profile of this mouse model going to result in a drug that works? And then there's other people that want to get into the launch dynamics, and is that going to work? And so I think that there is a good way, or almost like a perfect way to do each of those calls. Understanding the landscapes, understanding the mechanisms, understanding the shortcomings of the mouse model. Like, okay, that's the right way to do that call if you want to do it. Not every investor wants to get into that level of detail or at that point in time. But I do think if you want to get into the preclinical work, you better be understanding, the shortcomings of a mouse model in this disease, or why is the zebrafish the right model for epilepsy? Like, if you're going to get into that work, you better understand it. You're going to have some basic understanding of, or maybe even very elite understanding of what all that means. And I think there's a really good way to do a launch call. And I don't think it really matters if you're a pharmaceutical executive or an analyst or maybe a patient, because I don't really care about market share. But if you're trying to understand that, there's a right way to understand that. So I think it's much more about where in the development pipeline or the value creation moments in the topic you are than, the types of questions.
Do you think your clients do enough follow-up calls with, like the same expert? I find that, I think in my career, I obviously haven't done as many of these as you, but I can't remember. It's very infrequent, I think, in my career where we would go back to this one specific person because the conversation was so good, and we can, have the background of the previous conversation to sort of serve as a foundation that we double click on to get more insights. Does that happen enough, or do you think, or is that a tactic that your investor clients or your industry clients should be looking into more often?
I think so. That definitely happens. There was an issue in the industry with kind of like grooming or cultivating experts. A couple of bad actors were spending an insane amount of money talking to the same expert over and over. And companies put in caps even and said, like, okay, well, one expert can't make more than X a year from a client, because that's just like, what is going on? I think there's very legitimate reasons to say, well, I understand how this person thinks. I understand that they have a good track record on things in this knowledge field. And so, yeah, let's talk about it. Okay, what's the update? And especially as drugs move along through development. Okay, the phase 1 data was this. You thought it had to get to this level in the phase 2. The phase 2 data is out. Did it meet your expectations? Did you see anything in it that you didn't expect? I think those are really actually extremely useful conversations to have. Okay, the phase 3 is out. We talked all last week about what it could look like. Do you like it? Is it what you wanted? This seems like it hit. Well, yeah. But I told you the ALT issue is going to be high, and it looks like there is some on this cohort of patients. And so I am actually worried now that was the worst thing that could have happened in this data. Building both a dialogue around the development of a drug as well, or understanding a person has domain expertise and a lot of insight, are both valuable reasons to talk to a person.
Joe, we've covered a
We do
lot of
check-in
the.
calls a lot too. We do check-in calls a lot too. Like 6 months after the drug launches, let's talk again. Is it meeting your expectations? Is something new, exciting come up? Be surprised. Yeah. a
I
reimbursement
love checking calls
easier.
during launches, especially when the launch isn't to expectations, whether it exceeds or perhaps even underwhelms. It's really interesting to hear why.
Yeah,
And many of the
exactly.
times it's not connected to the data and all the topics when it was in a pivotal study.
Yeah, I mean, there's like all kinds of things. Like, I remember like the ProBench launch from Dendreon. There was so much concern around reimbursement time because the doctors were having to buy the drug, and it was at that time an insane price. And if the patient doesn't show up for the third dose, do you get paid for any of it? And like, there was an argument around in the investment community forever, just around is the overall survival benefit of, I think it was 2.8 months or 3.2 months enough to justify all this cost and rigmarole. Well, once it got out into the patient, there was all this other issues that came out around practice dynamics and working capital. I mean, these guys are talking about working capital. Well, I can only do one at a time. I can't afford all this drug out the door. And companies have gotten a lot more sophisticated on that since, but those types of things were really missed, I think, by myself. Even just thinking back to our investment position on that when the drug was approved. So, yeah, there's always things that are coming out, and finding out if they're resolving, finding out if they're improving at the patient at the clinical level is super useful and essential sometimes.
Joe, you mentioned the patient. We've covered a lot of the industry and the other side of things, I guess you could say, industry investors, strategic things like that. I'm curious. You've been doing all these calls. Do you feel like, with all the experience you've accrued, speaking to these physicians in various therapeutic areas, has it impacted your engagement as a patient with the healthcare system?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the first thing, and it goes back to something I've said multiple times here, is you don't want to be a nuisance, but understanding that the physician's a person as well, that they're not um, omnipotent, that they are having a day the way you are, and though um, asking when you don't understand something is valuable, is reasonable. When something is unexpected versus maybe your first opinion or your second opinion, is reasonable. And it depends on how serious the medical issue is. But if it's a serious medical issue, really having that appreciation that that one person's opinion isn't gold, or irrefutable, or something you can't explore if you don't understand it. So I think that does, at a very basic level, having that shift in perspective of this person in a lab coat or this person that has all these degrees is not someone you can't approach. I think is really useful, and I've definitely seen that in family members and things where if you just took the first opinion, and it could have resulted in a disaster. Obviously, it's not always that there's some magical thing hiding around the corner, but you know, being engaged with your own care has never been easier. I would say, people joke about ChatGPT as your doctor and things, but if you want to put in the work, you can look through so many resources now that maybe a generation ago didn't exist. We could talk about some of those, but there are really just so many more tools now to make sure that everything you're hearing and going to go through is your best guess, your best shot, and something you can be at peace with.
So, not to be too invasive on maybe your engagement, but now that you have this experience, what are some things that you can provide to people who might have to see a physician or have something that's perhaps very impactful for them individually coming up? What are some tips you would handle? Because we talked about the professional side of things, but when you're sitting in that, those benches inside a doctor's office with the paper rolled out on top of it, and your legs don't touch the ground, that kind of they take your weight and all that. You're sitting in there. You may or may not have your notes with you. What are some tips you'd give someone in that position to have better engagement with their physician and get better care, Joe?
Or I guess even think about it like from the perspective of like how can I prep for my doctor's appointment the right way, and then while I'm there, what are tips in the midst of it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't need this job, but I would say take notes is the number one thing. Don't just sit there. Ask the spelling of whatever they're giving you, whatever disease it is, so that you can go and understand it better. I think that's really helpful. Do it on your phone, bring in a piece of paper, whatever, but don't walk out of the room and say, I guess I just need to be on amoxicillin now. What was that? Like that type of stuff. I think that's one really important thing. Depending on the severity of what you're up against, I think understanding the dynamic that we talked about earlier in the call as an investor between community and academic, and understanding the strengths and weaknesses of those. So if you're with a physician who is not a fast adopter to new treatments, try and understand that and why. And again, you have to look through your own personal responsibility, right? Like, do you want to be the first person on a drug that got approved 6 months ago? Or do you want to let this guy go through his network and understand who uh, want to be aggressive in your treatment or not? Well, maybe if you're at a community center where they don't have all the newest stuff, you should go try and figure out a way to get a referral into an academic center or center of excellence. But you might not want to be in the center of excellence. If it's not something that you're super terrified about and it isn't like life threatening, you might not want to be a guinea pig. So it's really about your own trade-offs between the severity of what you're up against, how good the things are that are out there, and what your personal doctor's philosophy is on it. And so those are the kind of questions that you could ask. Like when new medicines come out, what's your process of getting careful or getting comfortable with it? The doctor will probably tell you. It might be one sentence. Wait a year and see how it goes. Oh, I love to try it. I get the newest stuff. I put it out right away. There's kind of an understanding that certain specialties are more aggressive than others, and there could be a million reasons on why that is. But like neurologists are notoriously slow adopters. Probably going to get, I don't know how many listeners you have, but maybe a pushback. But like urologists are more aggressive. And so you kind of see. I think it's just part of the history of the specialty. Did they have interventions or not? Right? Like neurologists didn't have a lot for a long time. So Alzheimer's is hard to treat. So, well, I don't know. Why would I be aggressive with things? If you're a urologist and you're getting new stuff all the time and new devices and surgeries and all this stuff, and it's really not going to kill anybody, you might be super aggressive. So these things have origins, but just ask your doctor. Like, how do you think about new stuff? How do you think about this? And that's in the doctor's office. I think there's a lot of things you can do outside of that setting, but I think that's a good way to get a sense of what you're looking at, and what kind of person you're engaging with. Because again, back to your biases, everybody has tendencies. Maybe it's not a bias, but a tendency.
And how about, you've talked about the various tools you can use, Joe. How do you feel about a tool like guidelines for the average individual? Would you suggest people try to familiarize themselves? Because I use them every time for myself. I find them to be extremely helpful. And I know already before typically I go into an appointment with a physician if there is an issue where we might be headed. And if there's any deviations, I have the structure already in my mind. It's like, wait a minute, why? Do you ever find those to be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that guidelines can be a little bit slow. So depending on what you have to be mindful of the kind of the pace that guidelines get updated. But they're definitely a useful way to understand what you're likely going to be told. I think there's definitely a lot of nuance around different academic hospitals and things like that having their own algorithms and guidelines internally that ultimately maybe become the national standard. So again, depending on the severity of what you're dealing with, I do think going to, maybe a large teaching hospital or getting into that ecosystem, even if they're not really a researcher themselves, because a lot of those people don't see that many patients. It's really more just to keep a sense of what's going on in their practice. But if they're part of a really respected institution for that illness that you have, they might have their own internal algorithms and guidelines that are a little bit more cutting edge that they then disseminate down to their community doctor level. So being part of like a Mayo Clinic or something like that, depending on what you have, could give you a little bit more institutional knowledge, even if it's just at the community level. I'm in a satellite office in Minnesota, but I'm part of this ecosystem. And I think they're all a little different. And I probably am not super qualified to give you all the nuances of it. But yeah, I have a general understanding from talking to different physicians that can be a differentiator as you look at different communities and which part of a practice you're going to be working with.
I think too, sometimes it's important. I mean, for our non-industry listeners, the guidelines are not written for patients. They're written for doctors. And sometimes the language can be very technical and confusing. And I think, the three of us sort of sit at the periphery of that and are able to kind of bridge between the two. But oftentimes what I've found, even just, trying to ramp up on a space and understand the guidelines, like a good place to start is to find like patient advocacy websites where they distill some of the treatment information into very everyday kind of simple terms. Like, this is what a doctor is going to look for. This is typically what you would start on. You'll start on rituximab plus chemo, and then, you'll move to this. So I think sometimes going to some of these patient advocacy websites where they're written for a patient can be helpful. I've also found, honestly, like with LLMs and ChatGPT nowadays, you can tell it, tell me what the treatment guidelines for this disease are, as if I was a sixth grader, and it'll just give it to you in really simple terms. Not to say that you should follow those, but in terms of like getting into a conversation with your doctor, how can you empower yourself with information and prepare yourself with questions or a framework to just understand your own care? Those types of things can be quite helpful.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's a nightmare to some of the doctors now that patients are coming in with these criticisms and questions from ChatGPT. But I do think, back to taking notes, LLMs are a great place to look at and say, here's what I'm being told. What are the risks? What might my doctor be overlooking? What would be the other school of thought on this? Let's say that's like a good type of question you can ask of, like, my doctor is a big believer in, let's say, aggressive management of prostate cancer. What would be the counter view of that? That my doctor told me that he waits a year. What would be the risk if I wait a year for all the new medicines that come out? And the doctor, or going on it right away. And then they'd be able to say, well, last year this drug was approved and it's really great. Maybe ask about it, you know. And if you're at a community doctor level where the doctor just isn't really watching that stuff, he or she might not even really know that that's available or have dealt with it before. You have to kind of remember, like, friction is a real thing in everything that people do in life. So if it's going to be a little bit hard for the doctor's office, you have to advocate for yourself and say, no, we got to get this through my insurance company. We need this,
Mhm.
like, prior auth managed. We need to, and I think you really need to stay on top of, even in a trusted institution like a physician, because they're human. So I think that's another thing to keep in the back of your mind. They have
So
soccer
I,
practice
as
for
we
their
talk,
kids and stuff too, you know.
Yeah. Well, as we talk about this engagement for patients, I tried to build a list of maybe just 3 to 5 quick things a patient can do to increase their odds of having better care for themselves. I want to share with both of you, and I'd love to hear your live feedback, and I'll try to keep it brief. So the first one is, Joe, you already alluded to it. Try to provide the best data, the best info. If you have symptoms in advance, try to get the timing, the observations of whatever you may have experienced. Things get lost if we, lean on our memory too much. It's better to document it. So the first one is just the data, the documentation. The second one is there is a certain amount of ownership you have to take. It's your care. And to offshore it to a physician and just expect that person to take care of you in the best way, I don't think is the best start. I think it's best to say, I own this. This is my situation. I want the best care. So I'm going to have to drive some of these things. Joe, you mentioned it before, the insurance issues and things like that. It's almost like you have to go in knowing there will be a lot of energy required in addition to what I'm dealing with to make sure I'm getting the right care. So I think personal ownership is there. I think 3, delaying care is not good. There's that old saying that is so much value even today, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That is still valid today. And so if you notice something, I think being delayed and being afraid of it doesn't help you. And so it's better to get the answers up front, because just sometimes we've all seen this, right? When you talk about stage 2 versus stage 4 tumor, it's a world of difference between those two. And sometimes the patient has control over that time of treatment. It's when they go in and say, it doesn't feel right. And so I think delaying is my number 3. I didn't consider this. I was talking to a friend and I heard this, and having your care established with somebody, because sometimes we get slammed, we get surprises. And if you don't have any labs done, if you don't have any established data on your aging, I think it gets harder, because then you're starting with like, well, we don't know what your baseline was. We know what it should be for your genetics and your age, but you've kind of drifted so far off course that without having the history there, it's a problem. It could be as simple as just like, basic readings at a dentist's office, but just having that established a priori, I think is really powerful. And then I have my number 5 is the others category. The healthcare system is not really built to take care of minorities or folks who don't show up in the healthcare system as much. Or if you look at the way they structure a clinical trial, it may lean toward a certain genetic pool of individuals. If you're not in that pool, you're on the fringe. And so that's something you have to keep in mind as well. They might prescribe a medication and a dose for you, but it's important for you to know, like, was that studied in your people, in your population? And that can make a big difference. And then I guess my 5 others has a second category: social media. I think this one's a double-edged sword, but I have seen in the patient support groups, some patients are really passionate about what they go through. So they'll post everything they endure and say, like, this worked for me, this didn't. Well, this question made my doctor want to do another test because of A, B, and C. And so even though social media has some aspects that are wildly unhelpful at times, because you always have to wonder about the source, there are times when you deal with other patients in those platforms, it can be very impactful. So those are my 5 points, and I just looking for both of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Joe, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I think that your point on the fifth one is good, and that's actually a great area to use some of the LLMs to say, I'm about to be on this drug, but this is my profile. How well studied was it, or what might have been missed in the development? A simple example is like pregnant women are almost always excluded for a million reasons, right? Pretty obvious ones. So we don't even need to go to structural anything to just know that there's a lot of people who just aren't in that. If you're very old, it's very unlikely that you were included in a trial. Obviously, there isn't always a good answer for that. But again, back to do you want to be super aggressive with new medications or do you want to wait? Maybe that's a reason, if you're not fitting the clinical trial population, that you should wait if you can, depending on the disease, right? Because now the world's going to get to use it. In that first year, you're going to see these patients that are more like you on the drug and how they respond. So that type of stuff I think can be helpful. But yeah, no, I think that that's a great list. I think that probably maybe the one thing that we haven't touched on is, depending on where you are, understanding that trials do exist out there, and patient advocacy groups are a great place to find entry points into trials. For the maybe more adventurous, you could look at something called clinicaltrials.gov. Not all, but nearly all American drug companies and even global drug companies now will list the trials that they're running, the patient types, the inclusion criteria, the interventions, all that type of stuff. And so if you or a loved one is in the unfortunate position of having a disease that doesn't have a great treatment or a great outcome percentage, that can be a place to look. And depending on where you're located in the world, you might not have a healthcare system that thinks that way. And so with the internet now, with the LLMs even making it a little bit more digestible and understandable, you can go on and search on these patient advocacy groups and ultimately clinical trial groups to find locations of trials and see if that works. So yeah, depending on how dangerous the situation you're in, that's a great way to add to the community of knowledge, because no drugs get approved without that, but also maybe get into something that could save your life or really change your outcome expected place that otherwise isn't available to everybody yet. Again, like you could have look at a phase 3 trial that you get enrolled in with extremely exciting science, and that might shortcut 4 years before where you would be able to get it in the real world, right? It's a 2-year trial, it's a year review. Your doctor doesn't do anything for the first year. Okay, well now you're 4 years down the road, and you might be too late. So those are great resources, I think, in the really bad situations to dig in and see what else is out there off of just things in your doctor's office the first day.
A couple points I'll add on the social media and internet aspect of it. I think that aspect of it is really helpful because of the connectivity of it. I mean, oftentimes if you're suffering with something, there's a way now to get connected to other people who are in the same boat as you. A lot of women who are going through pregnancy connect with each other online and, share tips and parts of their journey. And, people who are suffering from different types of cancers do the same thing. I mean, all those types of patient communities and being able to get connected to people who aren't, physically located next to you, but are going through the same experience or have gone through the same lived experience is super helpful. I will say, you need to take some of that stuff with a grain of salt, because oftentimes, the same way that comments work on like a tweet or something like that, it's always kind of the most extreme people, or even, just the same way like Yelp reviews work, right? There's very few people doing like, oh, this restaurant was great and I had a great time. It's always somebody who has a complaint about something or someone who had a negative experience. It tends to lean more negative than not. So just remember that sometimes take that with a grain of salt. It's not a complete sample size. Just because this individual had this crazy complication, it doesn't mean that you're going to get that too. But it is something that you should take as one experience. If you're concerned about it, you should be able to ask your healthcare practitioner about it, or, again, go to some of these other tools that are available now to the everyday person to inform yourself about, your own risk about that incident. I'll say the other thing that's really important when you talk to your doctor that you should communicate is like, what does quality of life mean to you? And some of that is like, how do you contextualize that for your doctor, right? Like if if you are someone who really likes going out and surfing and you like being out in the sun, it's important for your doctor to know that, so they don't prescribe you a drug that photosensitivity is a really bad side effect of it, right? Maybe they have a different drug with, a different side effect. That trade-off is probably something they'll consider, right? If, Sally really lives in Newport Beach and really likes to go surfing every morning when the sun's out, yeah, I probably shouldn't prescribe her a drug that is, gonna make her skin feel really insensitive and burn, right? If you're someone who's gonna, you have knee issues and you want to get your knee replaced, but you have like, a grandchild coming up, that's going to be born in a few months or so, maybe that's not the right time to like go get a knee replacement. So the context of like, what does quality of life mean to you? You like hiking, you want to be able to play with your grandkids, you do these activities that bring you a lot of meaning and joy and purpose and connectivity to your community. All of that information, that contextual information, is really important because it informs what a good full life feels like for you. And your doctor can kind of work around those things or have a more honest conversation about what parts of your life maybe need to be traded off to get, and for how long to get the care that you need.
Yeah, definitely.
I think it's a great point, Shivu, because I think if you have a challenge where there's so many different drugs, the side effects can be essentially a kaleidoscope. And that's a great way to also engage with your physician to be like, okay, I have a certain expectations for me to be able to live my life, but navigate this issue. I think it's one I hadn't considered before, but I think that could be really impactful.
Yeah, it's one that
I
I
wanted to,
struggle with even talking to family members is just how to really contextualize side effects. There's so many and they're so repetitive, I would say, on a lot of these drugs. And so how to really get your head around it. I do think patient advocacy groups, with the caveats you mentioned, can be a good place for that. Like, yeah, it's not that bad, or here I do this to get through this side effect. And obviously, there'll always be squeaky wheels, like you said, on Yelp, but I do think that that can be a place to give a little bit of a framework or a better color to what otherwise looks like a label that's just scary or confusing. And so that could be a good place to find some community and hacks to make it work for you and get around it and all that type of stuff. I think is a great place to lean on that with the awareness that there's probably going to be some hysteria potentially and some weak, squeaky people in there that should be taken with a grain of salt.
yeah. Joe, we've talked a lot about the traditional physician engagement. I did want to touch at least briefly upon surgeries. And so I'm a big fan. Like you have to go into any procedure has what may not be as well understood, but any procedure when you go inside a human or you operate on them, complication rates. I think complication rates are not well understood. And so what is it? It's basically, if you have a procedure, because no procedure is perfect, it comes with the risk of certain things. It could be an infection at that particular site. It could be pneumonia. It could be other things that are far more um, scary to the patient. And so, what I've learned over the years is it's if we are forced into that situation where this is probably the best way for you to go, how do I know I'm getting the best surgeon? And so, one way is I can ask them about their complication rates. And rarely will you get to ask that surgeon directly. I think that's important for people to know is that typically their staff is the one that you're engaging with the most, and you see them literally right before. So, one of the things I've learned is, and I'm curious to your feedback on this, both of you, asking about complication rates. And so, for example, if the accepted complication rate from a particular procedure, say 2% pneumonia, 2% infection, and you ask their staff, well, it could go one of a few ways. One, they pull back a little bit. That's already a red flag to me. It's like, no, you should know that stuff. And if they say, oh, well, it's what you'd expect. No, I want numbers. Sense are a reason that they exist for a reason. So that's one thing I try to initially separate, I guess you could say, the wheat from the chaff. If I don't get a candid answer, already I'm not thrilled. And I will wait until you can get it. And if you still don't have it, we're out. We're going to go somewhere else. I think that's one thing I do. And then also is the number benchmark to what I'd expect. I give you that 2% for certain things. Is this particular patient high? Is this particular surgeon higher? Are they lower? Is there a reason? I think Shivu, you mentioned a while ago, some surgeons take tougher cases. So that national standard may not apply. They might want to characterize that to you because maybe they deal with the patients who've had a significant and lengthy prognosis. They're not catching patients as early, and that's where their passion is in the system. So I want to ask you, maybe with Joe, we'll start with you. Like, is that something you've probed upon, not just in KOL calls, but also in like your engagement as a patient as well? Do you think that could be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I probably have less experience there than the other areas, but I think that it's really important to get your arms around it, like you said, with data, with real answers. But again, it goes back to some of the other stuff we talked about, the context of what this doctor's doing. Is he taking easy cases, hard cases, things like that? So it's not something like a gotcha question; it's a dialogue, and a lot of times it can open up a conversation around what the patient should be doing too to stay out of those areas. Because a lot of times complications come from things that the patient didn't do themselves, right? Whether it's dressing and cleaning the wound properly, going back to activity too soon, maybe not telling the doctor everything that's actually going on with them beforehand. So sometimes you can elicit, I don't say excuses, but more color about why some of those complications happen when you start to ask about them and can make a more robust conversation too. So I think it's just another opportunity to get more information, make sure that you're getting, you're not just getting the quick answer, right? Because a lot of times, like it's just simple things like, well, if you don't take the anti-inflammatory medicine, you have problems, right? Like that's where we know these patients into it, right? Oh yeah, well, this guy came in and didn't even pick up that script. Like, okay, we didn't pick up the antibiotics. You need those, right? Or you didn't finish the antibiotics, like stuff like that. And it sounds silly, but those come up in the numbers. And so I think having that kind of conversation around what works, what doesn't work, why are these things happening, what are the cases like, especially on the really scary stuff, let's say. that could be an area for you to advocate for yourself.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything Joe said. The surgery one is interesting too, because there's so many different types of surgeries, right? Like there's surgeries where, I got my ACL repaired, right? That's a different type of surgery, but there's surgeries where you got to like implant a device and, maybe you're getting a pacemaker and things like that. And so they're all very, different, right? They're all very different. There's surgeries that get done with robots versus, and some physicians, maybe the standard of care is to do like a robot based surgery, but some physicians are just like, well, I'm not comfortable with that. So I think getting more context is always better, I think, as a patient. And I think you should just ask for the context, whether it's the types of cases that they see, are they less severe, more severe, the frequency of these types of surgeries that they do, right? The surgeon, depending on what you're talking about, might not be like a specialist in one type of surgery. They might be like a person who does like knees and hips and, feet,
Mhm.
right? So how often are they spending their time doing knee surgeries versus hip surgeries, et cetera? Obviously that changes, right? Based on like where you're getting your care. Something, you're very passionate about, Kenny, is, like especially in rural settings, like the options that you have are not as wide versus if you live kind of closer to a bigger city, you have more types of doctors, more types of specialization, that kind of thing. So context matters. I mean, try and get as much context as you can.
Yeah, I want to share a quick story with you both. It's actually because our current FDA commissioner, Marty McCary, he wrote this book, The Price We Pay, in 2019. I read it in 2022. It's chapter 6. I still can't forget. It was 3 years ago. I still can't forget it. There's a character in there named Dr. Dinner. He's an OBGYN at a hospital, and he called him Dr. Dinner because he seemed to perform a high rate of C-sections so that he could get home at a specific time. Because as vaginal deliveries, they take time, they're unpredictable, and they may take hours. It's typically reasonably well accepted that vaginal deliveries are better for the mother and for the baby for various reasons, and C-sections come with significant complications. They are a surgery, infection, scarring to the cervix, making future vaginal deliveries difficult, and they can cause chronic pain to the mother. And so Marty McCary, in the book, in this chapter, was highlighting how scary that was to see that his C-section rate as an OBGYN was 95%. And so I was thinking, for today's conversation, what is a national standard? And so I found the overall C-section rate for all births in the United States, including high-risk pregnancies in the US. It's a very specific number, 32.1 to 32.3. Dr. Dinners was 95. If I was a mother, or if my spouse, or if someone I cared about was in that situation, I think that's very valuable information to know. And so it's these types of benchmarks that I think are so powerful and important. And so I just wanted to share that because it's a staggering number. And I don't know if that physician's still operating. He didn't go into specifics, but it can be jarring when you look into some of these things.
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Is that something that would be disclosed as a patient if you asked about it? Do physicians, are they forthright about that when you're doing a introductory or pre dialogue? What kind of, do you have any knowledge on what your rights are as a patient to understand those types of things? Is that like a
I
personal
don't. That's a
preference that
good
the doctor
question, though.
has, or whether the hospital has a policy type thing? I just don't know how getting that information is and how transparent people are. So I would imagine this guy doesn't want that out there, is I guess my point.
Yeah, I'm sure he doesn't. I think it was Marty, because he was doing a tour of the country looking into healthcare and how it's like administered. Because that book discusses basically pricing and what we do to patients when you care for them. It can kind of put them into financial trouble. And so he was doing like this survey tour. And I think he had access, because he's a Hopkins surgeon by training. He had access to some of these information. But kind of one of the things he alluded to is that all hospitals track these rates. They may not share it, they may not want to share it, but he says it's well documented. They know every physician, the department, all what their benchmarks are. And I think, Joe, as a patient's rights, I don't know what the truth is on that. Like, are we allowed to ask, and are we able to get that information? But I think just having that awareness and asking and seeing how they respond to it is valuable.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think it goes back to something Joe said early on in our conversation, is if you don't know something, you should just ask. There's no harm in asking. If you don't know a word, if you don't know what the complication rate is for something, just ask. The worst thing they can say is, I don't know, or I'm not allowed to talk about it. And then, you can kind of take next steps from there.
And that would be my overarching thing on all this. It's funny, when I was a kid, my dad would tell me before school every day, ask questions. That was like his piece of encouragement as I left the door.
Your
like I
dad
said,
was
trying to.
much nicer than my mom, Joe. My mom would say, don't talk without raising your hand. Don't make your teachers annoyed with all the talking that you do in class."
There was plenty of other advice, but I mean, I turned it into a career. But I would say, yeah, ask questions is a really good mantra when you're going through the healthcare system, and kind of advocate for yourself. There's a lot of information out there, and the world's only getting more transparent, I would say, in terms of side effects, treatment options, patient experiences, scientific breakthroughs. All that stuff is available in a way that was really unimaginable even 20 years ago. So take advantage of it. And again, you don't need to understand it all day one. You can take time to learn it slowly.
Yeah, it's a process. I think it's easy to also forget that these physicians have gone through years of training. So it does take time for you to understand where they're operating and how to get the best care, and even just interviewing doctors from the industry perspective. Joe, as we close, I realize we kind of glossed over something. We just kind of went into your experience and your really unrivaled skill in interfacing with physicians. We glossed over the fact that you're an entrepreneur, a successful one for 11 years, you mentioned in the beginning. I wanted to congratulate you on that. And I have to ask about Noble Insights. This is an acquisition your company made. I thought it was really cool to hear. And I just want to maybe, can you tell us a little bit about it, why it made sense? This was press released recently, actually. It's part of the reason why you've been so busy lately, amongst other things. I was just curious if you could tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, sure. So thank you for the kind words. I wonder sometimes how successful we are, but we have staying in business for 11 years is something. So Noble's the second company we bought. The first company we bought was Truth on Call in 2019, and that was really um, a physician survey and panel business. And back to our conversations around academic versus community, it had a lot of community doctors in it that were hard to find. Again, speaking to how they just don't really live in this world. And so that was able to add, so maybe just to have a step back, Slingshot Insights is a company that sets up interviews between subject matter experts and people who would like to learn more about something. That's typically investors. Sometimes it's pharmaceutical executives. Sometimes it's individuals who are investing in companies. We were doing phone interviews, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, get on the call, ask your questions, hang up, and we produce a transcript. Surveys can be a really powerful tool for people who want to get more opinions at once, 20, 30 people in a structured way to find averages, things like that. But for our entire history, we were only in healthcare. So by buying Noble, we were able to take a company that had done every sector for 14 years and bring that to our customers and bring our experts to Noble's customers. So we have been thinking for really since inception what the right way to do more than healthcare is. And we could talk on probably a whole nother podcast about that. But how do you get credibly into energy, industrials, AI, technology, all that type of stuff? And this was a way to do that. The great thing about their company was that they've been doing that for 14 years, but they hadn't created any transcripts. They hadn't created any kind of shared documents across their customers. They really were just providing that one-on-one consultation. So we're able, and we're working right now on integrating them to all of our systems and tech, and taking their great set of experts and adding them to ours, and then bringing them to all the customers that we're working with, and then trying to really let the people that work there do more what they do, which is find great experts for their clients and not worry so much about every aspect of running a business. Because as you guys can attest, I'm sure the minutia, it ends up taking most of your day, and it's hard to drive innovation for people and find great new stuff because you have to pay the bills, you have to keep track of who owes you money and all this type of stuff. Being able to bring all those problems onto our team and let the people at Noble just kind of keep finding great insights and experts is something we're really excited about. And it's something we've been looking for years. Truth on Call built out our healthcare database and added surveys, and Noble's built out our other database and added the ability to talk to really anybody about anything in the world now, not just
And Joe, I'm
doctors.
just the team. If you don't mind sharing a little bit, I believe you had a co-founder, and it was you two, I think, for a while, just in the beginning. Can you remind us, like maybe two in the start, and then where are you folks now?
Yeah, so she's still with us at Colleen Teep. She has a different background than myself. I was hedge fund finance, did these calls. She was a management consultant and was doing Oracle system implementations for Perot systems before it got sold to Dell. A lot of traveling, a lot of making sure things actually run properly. So it was a good combination of somebody who could actually create a professional organization, and then myself, who had a lot of experience on the customer side and product side, I guess you could call it. So yeah, so we're still running the business with this team. We're about 25 now people and hiring. If anybody wants to lead expert calls, let me know. If anybody wants to go find great experts from our databases and provide them to clients, let me know. We're looking for people. But yeah, so we're about 25 now, almost all in the US. We've stayed remote, so our employees are in many different states, and have had a great time being able to hire kind of agnostic to geographical constraints. We don't have to make it within a 5-minute drive from some campus in Austin. People are in Nashville, they're in Chicago, they're all over. So that's been great for us to be able to kind of pull from the right person rather than just the best person down the block.
The growth is really exciting over the 11 years. I just want to congratulate you. I think your team does a great job. And
Thank you.
a little part of me got sad when you say you're not running the calls anymore, because I've read your calls, I've listened to your calls, and they're the best in my opinion. But I understand, when you're running places, you can't do them all the time.
Well, maybe one day we'll be big enough that I'll have enough free time in the day to go back to leading calls, because I do enjoy it and find them really useful. It's a great way to get up to speed quickly on something,
Of
no
course.
matter what the
Yeah.
topic
So
is.
Joe and Shivu, as we wrap up, anything else you wanted to mention before we close?
Not for me. No, this was great, Joe. We appreciate your time. I know that our listeners definitely, whether you're an industry person or a non-industry person, I think learned a lot from this conversation.
Yeah, I would say just be patient with yourself and, ask questions and don't expect yourself to know everything. Take notes, go back, advocate for yourself, be curious, and yeah, don't put pressure on yourself or think you have to know something you don't. That's why you're paying everyone. That's why you're the person there looking out for yourself.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, Joe, thank you again for your time today, and I look forward to learning more about Slingshot and your growth, and hopefully we can chat again in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been great being on with both of you and appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts. Anybody who has any questions or feedback or anything, happy to hear it from you. Send me a message or an email. I'm on Twitter. I'm on all sorts of places on the internet. So reach out if you disagreed or agreed with anything, had any feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right, so Kenny, it's just us now. We just finished speaking with Joe. Honestly, thought it was a phenomenal conversation. I hope
It's
our
great.
audience thought so too. I thought it would just be helpful for us to kind of recap some of the really interesting insights that Joe shared with us, and some kind of take-home points that our audience can leverage for, their day-to-day work, if they're interviewing physicians or talking to KOLs, or even if just as a patient, how you can get better engagement with your doctor. So I'll start off, and then, feel free to jump in. I think one of the really important points that I think Joe brought up was about confidence, and, walking into that room, being confident in yourself, but not feeling like you need to be an expert. You don't need to be intellectually a knowledge expert on the same level that your doctor is. It's okay. Don't try and belong. It was one of his lines, which I thought was a great way of summarizing that sentiment. And so you don't have to belong. You be you and ask questions, and don't be afraid of asking what might seem, he didn't say it this way, but what might seem like stupid questions. It's your health. Something that we always talk about is you need to be in the driver's seat of your own health. These people work for you, and it's okay for you to ask them questions if you're confused about something, you don't know some acronym or vocabulary word that they used. So I thought that was really, really helpful. And then the second piece of, in calls, when he is talking to physicians, always repeat back what they said in your own words. Doctor, let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. What I heard was, and then repeat
Yes.
it back in your own words. Make them acknowledge your language and have it resonate with them. Because sometimes, we're all this way. If you and I are talking together, we'll, intersperse a lot of industry lingo, and it can kind of be excluding for people who don't necessarily know what those terms and structures mean. And so it's important to repeat back what your doctor said to you in your own words to make sure that you're understanding it correctly.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Shivu. I think the confidence aspect stood out to me when he talked about engaging, and hopefully, as a patient, we don't have to talk that much to physicians for our own care. It was his thinking was from a professional dynamic, but just being aware that, look, I may not know as much as this other person. I may not know as much as the doctor, but I'm the one paying the bill. You serve me. That is the right way, I think, to think about it, to extract the greatest care. And it's not about a power play. It's about the truth and the dynamic and getting the best care for yourself. And so if there are things that you don't understand, they gloss over, oh, we would never do an MRI for that. We would do a CT. Well, why? Like, it's okay to ask those things. And it just because it seems like everyday standard of care, mundane, maybe even minutia to them, doesn't mean it's to you. So asking and being comfortable to ask, and then just the whole thing of just taking notes, because from a patient's perspective, if you're going through something, you may not be as sharp as you normally would be, which means the note taking is even more important because you can go back. And hopefully it's a one hit thing and you never have to go back into the healthcare system again. But if you do have to re engage, it's good to have that history.
Yeah. I think another point too is, we didn't touch on this directly, but indirectly, and I think most patients feel this, right, is that sometimes you don't always have enough time with your doctor. There is a crisis, and we're probably going to talk about this in future episodes though, but there is a shortage of MDs and DOs and just, doctors in our country. And a lot of them are really overstretched and have to see a number of patients in a particular day and don't have all the time that they even want to spend with a particular patient. It's important to for them to treat you like a human being and you to also treat them like a human being. But, knowing that they don't have all the time in the world with you, it's important to, take notes, ask questions, and make sure that you're getting the most out of that interaction that you can. And so don't be afraid, to use your own words and, ask questions and interrogate them on things that are important to you. And we've talked about this before too. I think oftentimes the best doctors are the ones who appreciate that, right? They appreciate the
Yes.
patient who comes to them and is engaged in their own health and wants to ask questions and wants to understand where they're coming from.
I think it's a good point. I've engaged with a lot of physicians for either myself or loved ones before, and the ones who lean back, the ones who say, "Why are you asking?" It's rarely going to be a fruitful dynamic. And so just being able to decipher and say what their comfort level is, because what's implied when you ask these questions is not just their care expertise, but their awareness outside of just you. And if you see that they actually have good peripheral vision in the space, that's just better for you. And so I think that's priceless. One thing I did want to highlight, I thought Joe brought up a really good point because, I had my 5 points. I'll iterate them here. Provide the best info, have documentation. Best care is going to come to the engaged and aware individual. You have to take ownership. Delaying is not good. Fear, we have to deal with it. Delaying is not the way to go. Have your care established somewhere. That history longitudinally is very valuable. And then the others, healthcare system, minorities, and that there's things like social media as well that have, like I said before, a double-edged sword aspect to them. The clinical trials thing I think is interesting. So this is where it can get a little complicated for people. But if, as Joe mentioned, if you've reached the exhaustion point for what the healthcare system can do for you, it may behoove you to look into alternative treatments. And like you said, if some physicians are going to lag the system in adoption, you get to something faster. And clinical trials are, a lot of people think, oh, there might be costs of that. Frankly, a lot of clinical trials don't have that cost up front
Free
for you as.
99. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's very different. And so you might have logistics costs, but it provides the access to you that you may not get that easily. And clinical trials are very closely monitored. So while the drug is obviously not yet approved and in what we would consider an experimental phase, you are closely watched. And before you ever start any of that, you can get a lot of advice on what's the right way to go. Do you think this is the right way? And then, of course, the risk of, if it's a placebo controlled study, well, shoot, what is my chances of actually getting the drug versus placebo? And you can look at the
Yeah.
randomization. Is it 1-to-1? Is it 3-to-1? Those types of things. But there are probabilities to that as well. So there's a lot there, I think, for patients as well. I think for maybe some of the scarier indications, those are the things that could be really impactful.
And remember too, for some of these studies, getting placebo kind of depends what type of disease that you have. Most of the time, if you have cancer, they're never gonna put you on placebo because it's unethical. You'll get something. Going back to the point about not having enough time with doctors, not having enough time to see patients. I mean, one of the best things about that dynamic is that if you're a pediatrician or you're in family medicine, the nice part about those types of doctors is you see them recurring over a long period of time, so they're able to build a relationship with you. They're able to understand your family dynamic. They have a greater visibility into what your day-to-day looks like. And so going back to what I was mentioning in the podcast about quality of life, that quality of life and being able to see what that means to you as a patient happens over time. It happens because you understand that person, just like anybody else. You and I have done this podcast now for several months, but we have a friendship going back many, many years. I know a lot about your life and you know about my life, and I know what a good day looks like for Kenny, and what a good day looks like for me. Trying to be vulnerable with your doctor and kind of giving them some insight into like what you do on a day-to-day basis, what that quality of life is and how that impacts how that might impact your care is really important, right? Maybe you're in a job that you have to lift a lot of heavy things, right? That's important for them to know. You're just at a desk job, or you have to, drive a really long period to go to somewhere. You have a really stressful job, like maybe you're a hedge fund manager and you're just stressed out all the time, right? Like
Mhm.
they need to understand like what quality of life means to you, and they can guide your care in the right way to make sure that not only are you, if you in the fortunate circumstance to have a disease that's threatening your existence, like live a long life, but also live a high quality of life as well.
Shivu, actually, your point, give yourself more credit. You said they can guide your care, but if you're the one probing on quality of life, it's you guiding it. That's what
True.
it goes back to. The patient has that ownership and awareness. So I love that point because I think it's really important. This also goes back to just having that longitudinal history with a provider somewhere is very impactful because they'll know. They know the history. They understand, oh, some of these things aren't going to work. Well, if this medicine causes pruritus or itch of some sort, I know this individual will not tolerate that well versus others that might.
It's important. I mean, we'll touch on this, I think, in future pods, but I think especially like the dearth of people going into things like pediatrics and family medicine is something to, you cause some alarm over, right? Like those are the types of healthcare practitioners that you build long-term relationships with and who can see you sort of evolve over time and have a more visibility into, what your life is and be more of a partner, a more informed partner in your healthcare journey than someone you might see for the first time and only has 10-15 minutes with you. The last point I was going to bring up, and then, please share anything else you wanted to, was I think just touching again on that difference between like KOLs and community physicians. These are big, broad buckets. None of these groups are not monolithic, but generally, I think important to keep in mind that like KOLs, key opinion leaders, they're typically ones who are, publishing a lot of papers. They're on or, running or are principal investigators at trial sites for a number of clinical trials. They have their finger on the pulse more or less about like new medicines that are coming up. Oftentimes, like when we talked about guidelines in the conversation, they're often folks who are informing what those guidelines are and how they might change over time. So generally, I always think of folks who are in that KOL bucket as, they're working at big academic medical centers typically, right? They're at, we're in the Bay Area, UCSF and Stanford. If you're in Florida, it's places like, Moffitt Cancer Research Center. If you're in Texas, it's places like MD Anderson or Baylor and, big sort of academic medical institutions like that. Whereas community docs are, not in those locations. They're probably seeing a larger volume of patients. They might be a little bit slower to change their practice behaviors and their treatment decisions to be up to date with the most novel medicines. Some of them might not be as aware of those novel medicines entirely, right? They get their information through their colleagues in their network, or maybe they don't they don't have the luxury of being able to attend as many conferences as someone who's, a big chunk of their job is research and developing medicines. So I think that dynamic is important to keep in mind. And you can always, use the internet, use tools like LLMs and ChatGPT or whichever LLM of your choice is to inform yourself on like what are the latest medicines for this particular disease? What are the latest trials? Like what should I be aware of? How is treatment changing? And come informed to have a more fruitful discussion about your care with your physician.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We mentioned guidelines, and I know that they're technical and very involved, but Shivu, I think we should do a podcast on just guidelines. And I think maybe if we could find a KOL who's helped write one at some point, it doesn't matter if it's the same TA that we discussed that day or if that KOL wants to run with that same space. I think it's just important for people to get a glimpse into that room of so many physicians who are clamoring over a particular line of treatment and what does it mean as they review the data to get there. I think that would be important to get into, and also might demystify the technicals a little bit. And to your point, I thought you had a good one on AI. Like, yeah, just decode it. Okay, that's what's for diabetes. These are the lines of treatment. I don't understand some of these things. I don't understand how A1C and HOMA are interrelated, if at all. So explain that to me. I think that could help people a lot. 2 points I'll make. The power of AI, we mentioned it. It was Scott Gottlieb, I think, a couple of months ago on CNBC said that AI, or the large language models, they're actually beating medical students on the USMLE scores. And that to me is, he was surprised, but I was as well. Now, does that mean they can actually treat a patient? It's very different when you just spit out facts and like a question in that manner versus actually treating a human being sitting in front of you. Those are very different things. But the facts are there. And if those facts are there and they can answer it, it can help you. It's a tool for you. And the speed and simplicity can be a powerful metric. So those are the two things I wanted to share as well, that I think guidelines require more time. We can get into it, and just the power of AI.
On the AI point, I'll frame it in a different way, but in the same direction, which is AI is already making its way into how medicine is practiced, right? There's so many companies, healthcare institutions, big hospitals that are trying to leverage AI to make their lives easier, whether that's really simple stuff. I mean, quote unquote, simple stuff like the administrative sort of paperwork and accelerating that aspect of it, or even being kind of companions to individuals' care. So the people that are taking care of you are already trying to figure out how can they use AI to make their lives easier and enhance their ability to give you care. There's no reason why you shouldn't be doing that also.
It's a good point. I think those are all my topics. Anything else you wanted to add?
No, that's it. I mean, as Kenny mentioned, I think there's so much to unpack here. Even after the call, Joe gave us a lot of good ideas about future podcast episodes as well with related topics. So, I mean, I think we'll definitely try and do one on guidelines. We have a couple of other ones related in the pipeline, related to kind of care in rural settings and things like that. So if you like this sort of topic area, please let us know in the comments. If you like, kind of having these shorter summaries and reflections on some of these calls at the end of it, please let us know. We're always testing out different formats and want to make sure that this podcast is most value add and useful to you, our audience. So anything else, Kenny? Are we good to?
I think we covered it.
All right, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening to Drug Dealing. We'll be back soon with our next episode. So take care, everybody. Hey, everybody. This is Shivu. Just one more thing before we close. If you're interested in learning more about Joe's company, Slingshot Insights, you can head to slingshotinsights.com to learn more about all the different products and services that they offer. And additionally, Joe was very kind enough to offer a special promotion for drug dealing listeners who want to become members of Slingshot Insights. So if you go to Slingshot Insights right now, and enter the promo code DRUGDEALIN25. That's DRUGDEALIN 25. You can get your first month off Slingshot's starter tier membership, which is normally a $50 a month membership. You can get the first month free by putting in the promo code DRUGDEALIN25. So if you're interested, we have the info that you need right up on the screen. Head over to Slingshot Insights and use that promo code.